Okay, we are live. Smile you on camera. Okay, so one of the tough questions. The story of what appears to be a religious extremist, Pinchas, a zealot. We see the story at the very end of the last Torah portion, and now comes a reward for his act from HaShem, which actually is a twofold reward. He's been given a covenant of peace, shalom, v'natati lo et briti shalom, and he's also been given a covenant of brit kehunat olam, which is the eternal, everlasting kehunah. He's got to be, it's like that famous joke, he becomes a Kohen. It's like that famous joke, how can he become a Kohen? You're either a Kohen or you're not a Kohen, right? So it sounds like he becomes a Kohen at this point, which Rashi says, indeed, he becomes a Kohen. He becomes a Kohen because Rashi explains, even though he's coming from the family of Kohanim, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron Kohen. His grandfather is Aaron the high priest. His father is Elazar, who is the son of Aaron, who also became the priest. So it's like a famous joke about a Georgian Jew, right? Who comes to a rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I want to become a Kohen. How much do I need to pay?" Rabbi says, "Well, it's impossible. I cannot accept it, He says, "No, I really, really need it." And then nagging and nagging, and every single time he comes and offers more and more money, at some point the rabbi doesn't know what to do. He offers him 1,000,000 rubles. I says, "Okay, fine." He's making some blessings. He says, "Okay, now you're a Kohen. But tell me one thing. Why do you want to become a Kohen so much?" He says, "Because my father is a Kohen. My grandfather is a Kohen. I also want to be a Kohen, Atetz Kohen, Dedushka Kohen, Right? That's a famous joke, right? So, it seems to be a story over here, right? He becomes a Kohen. Hashem is telling him, now you're a Kohen. Mazel tov, you're a Kohen. But his father is a Kohen. His grandfather is a Kohen. What do you mean? So Rashi says something very interesting. Rashi says, well, the lineage of Kohen is indeed coming from his grandfather. He's the first Kohen, right? And the way it was meant to be originally was starting from Elazar, who is the son of Aaron, who is the father of Pinchas. It will go basically in inheritance, right? Whoever's going to be born from the point where of that story, all the future generations that are going to be born to them will become automatically Kohanim, and that's how it is. But Pinchas was out of luck. He already was born beforehand. So he didn't become Kohen automatically, right? So now he is being kind of admitted to his family, to his folk, and he becomes a Kohen. That's one explanation. The other explanation is actually, some other rabbis say, no, indeed, he was a Kohen. It's actually telling me something else. It's telling me, and here comes the connection of him being a Kohen and him getting the bris, the covenant of peace. Because his act was an act of zealotry. His act was something, we remember what he did. He saw one of the leaders of the Jewish people coming very brazenly and in front of the whole camp, taking on a Jewish woman and having a relationship with her in front of everybody, pretty much. And Moshe and Aaron, everybody's shocked, they don't know what to do. And comes Pinchas, and in an act of zealotry, kills them both. And that stops the Magifa, that stops the plague. In other words, he's managing to accomplish something which appears to be, if you look at it, on the surface, it's an act of zealotry, it's an act of religious extremism, but at the same time, it saves a bunch of Jewish lives because it stops the plague. Of course, the question to us is going to be, where is the place of such religious extremism? Rabbis on the spot are asking, why Moshe couldn't do it? Well, Moshe couldn't do it because apparently his position, his role is different. And we're going to understand here the very, I would say, ambiguous approach of Jewish tradition of the rabbis towards this act of religious extremism. They say, Alacha velo morin ken. It's something which is not taught, even though it's a law. It's a law for those people who want to take it into their hands out of pure, 100% pure motivation, which for the most part nobody has. It has to be pure motivation because he sees Hilul Hashem, he sees the tremendous desecration of the name of God. And he has this burning desire in his heart to He's basically fighting for truth. He's fighting for truth, not for his personal career, not for his benefits, not for his ego. And Moshe is just not taking that role. He's not in that position. His position, his role is different. Well, according to our sages, he came with a question. He came with a question. He brings this non-Jewish lady, by the way, an aristocratic non-Jewish lady, Kasbi Batsur, and says, is she permitted or not? And he continues. He says, Moshe, if you're going to tell me she's not permitted, who allowed you Tzipporah? Right? In other words, he puts Moshe in a very difficult position. And generally speaking, I would just, take it a little bit a bird's eye view. Jewish view on extremism and religious extremism throughout history is also somewhat ambiguous. You see, during the time of the destruction of the temple, we had a big revolt, a great revolt against the Romans. Initially, rabbis took part in that revolt and supported the revolt. But at the late stage of revolt, it becomes very clear that Rome is going to crush the Jews, and there's a serious risk that not only millions of Jews will eventually be enslaved, which happened indeed, and about 1 million of Jews died as well. That's conservative estimate. But also we're going to lose the temple, and we're going to lose pretty much any hope for our independence in the future. So rabbis take very pragmatic approach. Let's make a deal with Rome. But you have a group of zealots who says, no, you cannot do that. You are bigots, rabbis. You are not serious. You're not taking it all the way to the end. If we fight in Rome, if we're fighting for the truth, we need to take it all the way to the end. And what they do in besieged Jerusalem, Talmud is telling us there's enough food for more than 20 years. Because the wealthy people collected enough food. What they do, they burn all that food, so the Jewish people have no choice, so they're going to fight all the way to the end. One of the big rabbis, and by the way, leader of cultural Zionism, Massada, says this is an example of a great person who can foresee the future, R Yochanan Ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai pretends that he's dead. His students need to take him out of the walls of besieged Jerusalem, and you have the zealots standing there protecting the walls. They would only allow the dead bodies to be escorted outside the walls. And the tradition would be they would usually take a spear, right, to make sure that it's indeed a dead and not somebody who's just faking it, right? But out of an honor to a great rabbi, they didn't do it to him. They allowed him to pass through the walls, and outside of the walls, there's a Roman army. And the Roman general at the head of the army, right, Vespasian at the time, right? And all of a sudden, resurrection of the dead, he comes back to life, and he's in front of the general, telling him, Shalom Aleichem Malka. He's welcoming him as a king. And that's the story in the Talmud, right? Maybe it's an anecdotal story, but we know some details of the story is certainly true, because Yochanan Ben Zakkai is a real rabbi. He's the head of the generation. He's the head of that generation. And he must have had some sort of a dialogue with this very important Roman general, Vespasian. And Vespasian calls him back and says, how dare you? There's only one king, and the king is in Rome. How dare you call me a king? And according to the Talmud, at that very moment, he gets the message that the Roman troops rebelled and proclaimed him the most powerful Roman general, the new Caesar. And of course, as the story goes, free wishes. Free wishes. He's the new king. You can wish everything you want. And here comes a big surprise. He's not asking for the temple to be spared. He's not even asking. Beit HaMikdash is about to be destroyed. Yochanan Ben Zakkai is not asking about it at all. He's asking about what appears to be very trivial things. Like you're having this huge battle, right? Why wouldn't he ask? Do us a favor. Let's end this war peacefully. Please withdraw your troops. We will surrender to you. Just leave us alone. Leave the temple. He's not even making that request. Instead, he's asking for some elderly rabbi who is almost dying because he's fasting. He sees the forthcoming tragedy. He's fasting and he needs to be fed well. Okay, he's asking for the lineage of the Nasi, which is the Jewish religious lineage, to be continued. In other words, he already sees Judaism of the diaspora. He already sees the transition. And the last thing he's asking, this is very important. The last thing he says, give us Yavne and the sages of Yavne. What is Yavne? Today, even today on the map of Israel, it's a small provincial town. Most likely this man, this patient, doesn't even know where it is on the map. Right? So, what's the big deal? Puts a signature, no problem. Now, eventually, what we're going to have is, Jerusalem will be destroyed. We're going to have 1 million dead. We're going to have at the same time, next time we go to Rome, look at the Colosseum. You know who built the Colosseum? The Jewish slaves were the ones who built the Colosseum around the same time. The next king is going to be Titus, right? Titus is the one who will crush the rebellion. He's going to be the one who will destroy Jerusalem, burn the temple, and eventually they're going to hire, the numbers vary, between 60 to 80,000 Jewish slaves will be building Colosseum. Colosseum was built by the Jewish slaves, by our ancestors. So it's not just some beautiful building. Next time you go and look at the Colosseum, you're going to know. But something very interesting happening here. According to Hadam, this is how you find out who is a great person. The great person, as our sages tell us in the Talmud, is the one who can foresee the future. Ezu Chacham, Aroeh Tanolad. Who is a wise man? The one who can foresee what's forthcoming. It's not there yet, but it's happening. In other words, in the spiritual eye of R Yochanan Ben Zakkai, the temple is already lost. The Judaism of the temple is already gone. The question is, now what? In the most standard version of history of any other nation, this is the end. The Judaism of that particular period of time is going to be gone, and we're going to have a very important, influential Jewish sect, which will completely disappear. That's the Sadducees. These are the ones who were in control of the temple. These are the ones who were preaching Judaism without tradition, just the written Torah. And they were very influential, will completely disappear from the map of history. But the Pharisees will stay because they had the leadership like Yochanan Ben Zakkai who would foresee and foretell what's going to happen. There's this little provincial town of Yavne where you have a few dozen of Jewish scholars studying Jewish tradition, the oral Torah. That's the small thing to ask for, right? But eventually the Jewish tradition will remain intact because of that very little request he's making. Because he can foresee the future, he can see what's happening. But we can see also Yochanan Ben Zakkai is not in the party of the zealots who are fighting all the way to the end. The zealots are the ones who are going to be taking the last stand in Massada. And Massada, of course, is an important place. Massada, even today, is the second biggest, most visited attraction in Israel after Jerusalem, is Massada. And ironically, you have many Christians who go there. You have tourists from all around the world. And of course, the Israeli army, the IDF, is also taking their oath over there at Massada. Now, what happened at Massada is remarkable. The people you would have at Massada would be the last resort of the Jewish rebels. They're going to be the toughest of the toughest. They're only the ones that say, everything in the whole world can go to hell. We're going to keep on fighting. We're going to keep on fighting to the end. To the most bitter end, we're going to keep on fighting. And eventually they will commit mass suicide. There's a big question. Are you allowed even to commit suicide in Judaism? It's a big question, not so simple. But they will commit mass suicide. When Romans will come, after months of siege in Massada, and Massada was built by Herod the Great, this was meant to be a place that will be able to withstand any sort of attack. But you have the Roman military machine. It takes them months to build a proper siege of Massada. Eventually they succeed and they breach the walls. And as they come in, they apparently, according to Josephus, and Josephus was the witness from the Roman side, not in Massada but in Jerusalem. He knew about the events of Massada probably from the Roman side, from some Roman historians, from some witnesses who recorded it. But they are arriving and there's deafening silence. Nobody's there. According to Josephus, we know the story because there was one elderly lady who managed to hide inside one particular cave, and she eventually emerged and told the story of what happened there. They did find, much later, in the 60s. You're going to have archaeological research over there, because you realize Massada was not part of Israel until 1967, until the Six-Day War. And when Israel would liberate the territory in 1967, the archaeologist who's going to be digging there is a famous Israeli general, very interesting person, Yigael Yadin. Now, Yigael Yadin believes in the Bible. He actually walks with the Torah. He walks with the book of Josephus. He walks with the books of prophets, and that's how he digs. And so he's looking at what Josephus is telling us, and he's digging. And he actually found something remarkable. Josephus is telling us a story of what happened in Massada. Obviously, he was not a witness. It must have been a little anecdotal. But it's telling us a story of the zealots already realizing that the very next morning, they go to face their death. Because Romans already made the breach, and they just needed more time to concentrate the troops for the final attack. So it becomes absolutely apparent this is the end. So apparently, according to the story recorded in Josephus, the leader of the rebels is gathering everybody and is telling him what are the choices. And is telling him basically, we are the last Jews who are still free. We have a choice. Either we can accept the terms with Romans and are going to be enslaved. We're going to lose our freedom, or we're going to die as free people. And everybody decides we're going to die as free people. And of course, they cast lots and they kill each other. Now, when Yigael Yadin is digging Massada, he finds something very interesting. He finds a room which eventually will be identified as a synagogue. How is it identified as a synagogue? He finds a room with a bunch of scrolls. Many scrolls. And one particular scroll from the Tanakh stands out. This is the prophecy of Ezekiel. This is the prophecy of Yechezkel. The prophecy about the dry bones. That is a very important text. And especially symbolic when Yigael Yadin is finding that text. Because what the text is about, it's a prophecy that was given to Yechezkel, and Yechezkel at the time was in Babylon. Jewish people were captured. They were in exile. This was the low point of Jewish history. And HaShem is telling Yechezkel to come to a particular valley and to prophesy to the bones. The dry bones are lying there, the dead people, and they will come back to life. And it says the dry bones are the Jewish people. They think they dead. They think they have no future, but there will be future. They will come back to life. And see how symbolic this is. These Jews, they understand that basically, on one hand, they the last generation of the free Jews. But they also understand that sometime later, the prophecy of the dry bones must come true. And it takes about 2,000 years. When Yigael Yadin finally undigs those scrolls, and today, of course, Massada becomes the center of Jewish identity for many people. Mainly, by the way, non-religious Jews. Mainly non-religious Jews. The IDF takes it as one of the places where the IDF soldiers are making their oath, right? Even many non-Jews are coming there, basically because the place itself is beautiful, remarkable, and also it's a great story of Jewish history. It's a great story of basically not being willing to surrender. It's a great story, but it's a story of zealots. It's a story of zealots, and zealots were always very important, I would argue, like we see from the story of Pinchas. But we're never mainstream, we're always in minority. And the mainstream of Judaism was basically, I would argue, Yochanan Ben Zakkai, the man for whom the tradition continued. He's taken the path of, I would say, what Rambam would call the middle ground, being in the middle. Rambam, of course, one of our greatest sages, greatest rabbis of all times, following Aristotle, says the golden rule, you need to be in the middle. Everything that goes closer to the edge, to the katzer, is unhealthy, says Rambam. Right? Any sort of extremism is unhealthy. So, the majority, the leadership of the Jewish people, is trying to balance things, trying to stay in the middle. We have this conflict between two ideas, between peace and truth. People don't realize it very often, but they are in conflict. They are in constant conflict. As the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avot, the world endures or stands on three things. Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam kayam. ala emet, on truth, vala shalom, on peace, and in between the two is mishpat. Mishpat is the judgment which we need to make. We need to make a judgment. Sometimes we need to choose truth. Sometimes we need to choose peace. And if we take a look at the mainstream approach to the Jewish tradition, it seems like almost always we choose peace. Almost always rabbis decide to choose peace over truth. But there are moments, like this moment of Pinchas, when you need to choose truth, it seems. Because if you don't, everything's going to get lost. Everything's going to get lost. And again, I want to bring an example from a modern Jewish history. And again, I don't know if I'm right. And maybe it's too early to judge. We don't know. I'm sure you're familiar with one important episode that happened right before the War of Independence. The British are still in the country. And as a matter of fact, ironically, they betrayed their great leader, Churchill. In 1945 elections, he was not re-elected. And you have a Labour government in charge of England. The Labour government is promising Palestine, the Jews in Palestine, that the restrictions of the white paper, which limits immigration, aliyah to Israel, will be gone. And they make all sorts of promises. None of these promises will be fulfilled. And in 1946, you will have Jerusalem with barbed wire everywhere. You have certain zones where only British are allowed. You need to get through lines of checkups. Take a look at a post office picture of Jerusalem 1946. You'd be surprised. To get to the post office in Jerusalem 1946 will be harder than it is to get today to get to Ben Gurion Airport. One line of checking, another line of checking, the third line of checking, and yet, and despite that, you're going to have Jewish attacks on British objects and subjects, and Arab attacks from the other side. And at some point, the witnesses would say, almost every single day there will be some bomb in Jerusalem somewhere, right? Despite all those measures. Almost 100,000 of the British army, the army that won, one of the armies that won the war against the Germans, is located in Palestine, and they cannot stop it. 100,000 British soldiers were in Palestine. And you have three different groups in Jewish resistance that decide at some point to get united. You have the biggest group of Haganah, which is a left-wing movement, which eventually will be Ben Gurion, the Labour Party. And you have two right-wing groups, the smaller groups. You have the Etzel and the Lehi. The Lehi has been the most extremist. They are the real zealots. The Lehi are the ones who decide, even during the war, to fight the British. And at some point, they even want to join forces with the Nazis to fight against the British, which is, one can say, very questionable, but it's part of our history, right? They actually wanted to, nothing came out of it, but actually wanted to negotiate with the Nazis to fight the British, all the way to the end, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, I guess. That's the idea, right? It never worked out, but that was a plan of Lehi. And Lehi is the type of organization how they get the money for their terrorist attacks. They rob the banks. That's what these guys were doing. Eventually, you're going to have a future right-wing Israeli prime minister, Shamir, coming from that movement, right? And from Etzel, which is another not as extremist, but also right-wing, radical, political and radical movement of Etzel, Menachem Begin. Eventually will become a prime minister. The irony, of course, will be that Menachem Begin will become the first right-wing prime minister in Israel. For the first time in modern Israeli history, we'd have somebody who's not religious but very traditional be the prime minister. And for the first time, probably in Jewish history, of somebody who will become a prime minister of our country that will be not allowed to enter another country, because in Britain he would consider to be a terrorist. Why so? Because in 1946, when you have this Tnu'a Ameri Ivrit, the united movement of Jewish rebellion against the British in 1946, in protest for British not renouncing the white paper, limiting immigration, and the Royal Navy chasing after those poor Jews trying to get into the country illegally and sending them to the camps. Imagine, these Jews survived the camps, the concentration camps of the Germans, survived the DP camps in 1945, 1946, only to be deported to the British camps in Cyprus. And by the way, I was in Cyprus there, that we had a tour. Not a bad place, but we had, back in 1946, it wasn't so good, I can tell you. Arid area in Cyprus. They showed us the area. I was on the tour with Israelis. They did show us the area where those camps were. Not particularly nice conditions. They barely had enough drinking water. So it wasn't so good. Today, Cyprus is of course, vacation spot, but it wasn't a vacation spot for these guys, right? So, of course, you have this decision of all three movements to fight united, and the first important action is going to be blowing the King David Hotel. King David Hotel is right in the center of Jerusalem, and King David Hotel becomes a target because King David Hotel is the place where you have the military headquarters of the British and also the civil administration of the British in Palestine. As a matter of fact, you also have the High Commissioner, and the last High Commissioner, Lord Cunningham, is sitting right there. And actually, Lord Cunningham doesn't want to make any special military restrictions on that place because it sounds like he wants to maintain somewhat normalcy in Jerusalem so people can go, and there's a beautiful, very lavish restaurant cafe called Regency at the bottom of the building, and that's how they smuggle the bomb, the pretty big bomb. And as the explosion sounds, it's a huge explosion, and 91 dead in that explosion, 19 Jews. The royal miners are going to dig for 4 days and going to find some bodies on the 4th day. And it's going to create an uproar in the British Parliament. What is our army doing there in Palestine? 100,000 soldiers cannot maintain the order. And it's going to create also division in the Jewish camp because Ben Gurion and some people on the left are going to say we got nothing to do with that. Not only they're going to say we got nothing to do with that, they would also give out to the British some of the people on the right, which creates a tremendous, of course, until today. People remember what happened back then. It was a betrayal, of course, on the part of the left. There's no question about it because we have many documents today that tell us that it was a decision that it's pretty clear Ben Gurion was aware of it, right? And yet, the message is, does end justify means? When I take tourists, I'm a tour guide in Israel, to this building, and I show them the picture, a terrible, terrific, it's impossible to understand. With all the Arab terrorist attacks throughout all that period from the 30s until today, you never had anything of that caliber. 91 dead. 91 dead. It was a huge building. All the southern part of it totally collapsed. So the question is, does the end justify means? And if you ask people like Menachem Begin, they're going to tell you, of course it does, because you're going to see what happened right after. The British would make a decision to leave Palestine as a result of this. And Menachem Begin would tell you, if not for this act of terrorism, you can call it liberation, you can call it terrorism, whatever, semantics, whatever you want to call it. It was radical act, it was zealotry. We would never have our state.
Now this is political extremism, right? What if we review religious extremism,
which is what happens here, right? But before we get there, I want to make a little conclusion here, right? We don't really have a clear conclusion, but one thing I want to say is, I think Menachem Begin does have a point, even though I may personally not be necessarily the supporter of this position, right? But I do think he may have a point. And I think if we take a look overall from the position and perspective on Jewish history, right? Certain zealotry is always present. It's always, like Rambam says, somewhere on the edge. It's never at the center of Jewish life. But it's always present. And there are moments in history where the truth seems to require certain type of extremism. And here we have another question. I also wanted to talk about pacifism, right? You know some religions that declare pacifism, like Christianity. Famous line in the New Testament, right, about turning the other cheek, right? One thing is clear, Judaism does not support that view. It's not that we are against peace. We are all for peace. Every single Jewish prayer ends with our desire to have peace, to have shalom. But shalom is coming from the word shalem, which means complete. It's the desire to bring everything, all the elements together and make it complete. In the book of Ecclesiastes in Kohelet, King Solomon says there's time for peace and there's time for war. So there is such a thing as time for war. The war may not be the nicest thing to do, but certain things cannot be accomplished without war. I'll give a simple example. Was it possible to pacify Hitler? There were people who tried to do that. You know that Chamberlain was trying to pacify Hitler. Munich conference was about pacifying Hitler. And what it accomplished was the exact opposite of peace. Right? So arguably you needed a zealot. Somebody like Churchill. And many people in England back in the day looked at him as somewhat of a zealot because he was uncompromising. He said that's impossible. We're not going to make any peace with this monster. It was religiously uncompromising, and there were many voices in English establishment who were pro-Nazi, right? British were Aryans from German perspective. Hitler didn't want to fight England. He actually didn't want to fight England. If you take a look at his diary, you're going to see he didn't want to fight England. He thought he's going to be able to come to terms with the British very, very quickly. But because of a compromising line of Churchill, actually I would argue, he saw something very, very clearly. He cannot compromise with evil. You know, he was a very strong, very staunch anti-communist. But he made a decision the moment the Soviet Union was under attack. He said, if an evil person, an evil rule is being attacked by Satan, you need to fight against the Satan even with the bad guys. And communists certainly were the bad guys. It was very clear to Churchill. They were not the good guys. But he made this uncompromising stand against what he saw as evil. And that's how we won the war. That's how we won the war. So, going back to the Parsha.
So, Peter, what plague did he start?
So what happens in the story of Pinchas, this is the last week chapter, you can take a look at what happens there, right? Apparently, as a result of this act of, you could call it, I guess, sexual promiscuity, right? One of the leaders of the Jewish people openly wants to live with a non-Jewish woman. The plague...
The Shimon again,
yeah? The Zimri, his name is Zimri.
Yeah, but it's a Shimon shade.
Yeah, that's right. So, as a result, the plague starts.
What plague? Just plague.
People start dying.
I understand.
People start dying.
You
I don't know exactly how. I cannot tell you. I cannot tell you.
Because this...
I don't know.
Jump.
No, I don't know. But they start dying, right? People start dying. And it only stops.
As a result of that, it says...
that's what it says in the Torah, very clearly. Very clearly. And
they supported it, yeah?
Some of the Jews did. And what Pinchas has been given is the opposite of what he did. He's been given the covenant of peace. And he's been given a status of a Kohen, and a Kohen is a spiritual leader of a nation, which, by the way, his role as a Kohen, the role of a Kohen is, he's blessing people. What is the blessing he's giving? Shalom, peace. So the two things are connected. So one of the rabbis saying something very beautiful, says he needed, after that act, peace for his personal protection. As Rashi says, our commentators are saying many Jews were not happy what he did. He killed some of the dignitaries, some of the important Jewish leaders. Who are you to do such a thing? Right? He needed it for personal protection, but he also needed it for, so to speak, his religious vision, his religious picture. Extremism has its place, but very limited one. Later on, he's becoming the leader of peace, which is eventually what a Jewish leader, for the most part, is supposed to be. You see, in Jewish law, in Halakha, pretty much in every single instance when we have this clash between truth and peace, we have been told to choose peace over truth, right? Even though a truth is a very important value, right? But I can give you just one example of that. In Halakha, right, you have two parties arguing. This could be, let's say, Dinei Mamonot. This could be some laws of business affairs, right? There's always, it's actually quite a big pressure on the Dayan and the judge to come to some sort of a pshara, some sort of a compromise. This is seen as ideal. But compromise is not truth. Of course compromise is not truth. But compromise is peace. And so very often in life, it seems, we have been told that this seems to be the mainstream path. This is the most important thing, right? For the society to be working, for the world to be thriving, for the Jewish people to be able to fulfill their mission. And yet there is certainly a place for people like Pinchas to jump in the right moment and to do what's needed, which is the path of Emet, the path of truth. And may HaShem open our eyes so we shall see the difference between what's right and wrong, and being able to bring more shalom, more peace to the Jewish people, to the nation in large. But also, we do need truth, right? We do need truth.
But there is no control.